So a little bit of background imagery. Pandora's Box was an exhibition that was held here at Rochdale Art Gallery in 1984. It was a women-only exhibition, and it showed works across painting, drawing, sculpture and photography. The exhibition was organised by Jill Calvert, Jill Morgan and Mouse Cats. And it was developed initially by Jill Calvert out of the Women's Images of Men and the About Time exhibitions that were held at the ICA in London in 1980. So the exhibition here, Pandora's Box exhibition, had very specific intentions. The organisers wanted it to be a visual exploration of the metaphorical ambivalences of the myth of Pandora's Box and its implications in relation to the political, cultural and social situation of women at that particular time as understood in the Anglo-American context. So as I said, the organisers set out with some very specific intentions for this exhibition. It was an open selection, and yet they write about it as being an open selection, and yet they did specifically invite certain women artists who had been part of the Women's Images of Men exhibition that was at the ICA, and as Brian mentioned earlier, it did tour and it went to the Bluecoat. From what I can gather, and bearing in mind the information that I have is relatively limited in terms of the catalogue and some information that is in a book subsequently called Women's Images of Men. But from what I understand, they invited everybody that was in the Women's Images of Men and a wider sort of open submission from artists that they had visited in their gallery, in their studios, some of whom chose to be part of it and some of whom didn't. So they do talk about it as open submission, but I guess in contemporary understanding, that's not entirely true. So from initial concept, when they first sat down and started talking about this, to the point where they actually started stalling work in the gallery, it took 4 years. And that was partly to do with the fact that they couldn't find a gallery that would host it. They finally did get a grant from the Arts Council, and Jill Morgan here, who everybody's talked about a lot this morning, she replied positively and said that the show could happen here. So again, in terms of the intention of the exhibition, they wanted it to reach a non-art public, they said, although I'm not entirely sure what that is. And they wanted to show works by women who they said possibly just lacked confidence in their practice or lacked a wider exposure in terms of exhibiting. The organisers and the women who took part in the statements, which they have quite comprehensive statements in the catalogue, all talked about the importance of this being a women-only show. They talked about it in terms of visibility for women across a range of practices and a range of levels of experience, as I said, but also they talk about it in terms of it being an affirmation, and they use that word quite specifically. So it was an affirmation of the individual women artists involved. And they also talk about it being an attempt to represent or establish a sense of women's identity in the art world at that time, and to present something, and this is where I'm thinking about the sort of utopian language, to present something positive about women's roles in shaping the future. So this is a list of the participating artists, some of whom have gone on and names you may recognise, others who seem to have sort of slipped off the radar. And I guess I asked this on my closing slide, but I'm going to ask it now. I wonder what's happened to some of these women artists. I did Google absolutely everybody, but Google is a little bit fickle, despite the fact that my son says you can find out everything on Google. Turns out you can't. So if anybody does know about what these women have gone on to do in their practices, I would be very interested to hear from you. So why Pandora's Box? It seems like, again, in retrospect, it seems like a slightly strange sort of idea for an exhibition, a concept for an exhibition to be based around. They chose this myth particularly because they wanted, as it said in the exhibition catalogue, to give women's view on a theme which has provided inspiration for male artists throughout the centuries. What they also say in the exhibition catalogue is that they make very sort of direct links to the story of Eve as well, the biblical story of Eve, and they talk about both women being blamed for the world's problems. So they wanted to give women artists an opportunity to readdress that. They also state in the exhibition catalogue that they felt that Pandora had been used as a scapegoat by men to absolve them of any responsibility of the world's evils. So therefore, they said that they wanted this exhibition to become an opportunity for women to depict the miseries, and I know this sounds a little bit sort of odd, it says to depict the miseries of modern urban life, of alcoholism, domestic violence, world conflict, and the threat of nuclear warfare. And as Derek said earlier, that was quite a big deal in the 1980s, this sort of looming threat of possible world annihilation. They also wanted to use the sort of the medium of myth as a theme that allowed for a certain level of distancing, so that it wasn't necessarily, women making work directly about their own experience, but they were channeling it through this. This very specific story that had quite a sort of clear, I guess, for want of a better word, quite a clear set of visual imagery that could be produced from it. So one of the other things that they talk about in the catalogue, and comes up again in the book that's called Women's Images of Men, which is about this show and about about time and women's images of men at the ICA, and talks a little bit about some other exhibitions as well, is this idea of working in figuration, working figuratively. And I'm guessing, I'm not guessing, I have read around this, but also something to do with what happened in the 1970s and in the early 80s in terms of abstraction. So they wanted work that had a more immediate kind of narrative to it that allowed for a wider scope of, I guess, depicting the story of the myth, reinterpretations of the myth. They also wanted to materialise ideas around storytelling, particularly women's storytelling and psychology. It says in the catalogue about the unconscious mind as well. Again, I'm not entirely sure what that means in relation to this particular exhibition. And they wanted to bring to the fore the richness of women's multi-layered personal experiences. One of the things that I noted when I was looking at the work and doing the research that I did was that the works are almost unanimously quite dark. Some of them have some kind of glimmers of hope, but I don't know whether this is something to do with that kind of impending sort of threat, and also this sort of weird thing that they wrote about it being about the miseries of modern urban life. But a lot of them, they have sort of similar kind of themes and similar kind of narrative content to them. A lot of them depict the undervalued labour of women. A lot of them depict Pandora's box quite directly as a womb or as a sort of source of life. Pretty much all of them use the myth as a way of expressing their concerns and their resentment of men's misuse of power, and of how they write about it, this idea that the myth sort of denies women the sort of full potential, female potential, they write about it as. So, as I said, the title and the theme of the show was chosen to re-examine culturally accepted attitudes towards women as seen through traditional cliches, stories and myths. So the theme was open to individual artists' interpretation. So they all had the myth. They were given this quite a long time in advance. It does say in the catalogue that many of the women made works and then remade works and then discarded them and started again. I'm imagining, as it took 4 years to come to fruition, that some of them had quite a substantial amount of time to build up a range of works in response to the theme. But again, without having spoken to any of them individually, it'd be really interesting to find out more about that. So the intention of the exhibition was to present artworks that dealt with ways in which women were concerned with the world at that particular time. Again, like I said, some of that now seems a little bit off in hindsight. Again, it's been written about as being serious art, and I put that in inverted commas because it just seems like an odd thing to have said about an exhibition. Maybe all art is serious, whether it's humorous or not. It was politically engaged, and its intention was to address current social issues. So again, in the catalogue, there is a question a rhetorical question possibly, and it says, where will women look for images and symbols that are meaningful for her? So again, the exhibition did set out with these quite sort of worthy intentions, and in a way I wonder whether that is slightly why it possibly doesn't sort of hold in hindsight in a way that maybe it could have done, or maybe exhibitions like women's images of men did. Maybe they were trying to take on too much. I don't really know. Again, it's something that I would like to know more about. So the catalogue itself contains a very short text on the history of the myth of Pandora, which contextualises the show. And it also has a short essay called Gaining Ground, which contextualises women's art making practices at the time. So it talks a little bit about the 1970s and about Linda Nocklin's essay, and various things like that. So, like I said, the catalogue has very comprehensive statements by all of the artists included. In fact, the majority of that book is the statements by the artists. And interestingly, a lot of them say the same kind of thing. Again, it's quite hard to tell whether that's because they were given prompts or whether it is because they were all very much concerned with similar things at that time. Nearly all of them write about their conditions of production in relation to their housekeeping responsibilities. Nearly all of them give quite a lot of information, personal information, about their children, their jobs, their husbands, where they live in the country, and about how that has impacted on their ability to make work. Most of them, again, or many of them, include references to domesticity or maternity. They do literally say it's quite hard to make art when you've got a baby in a cot. And that again, I thought, God, that's really quite interesting, isn't it? Because that isn't something that is in the myth in any way at all, and yet that's what they write about. Most of them also wrote about the current political situation, how they perceived themselves to be living through an era of social oppression and economic deprivation. Most of them, or quite a lot of them, wrote about the horrors of war, they wrote about global famine, and they wrote about the fears of the future for their children. And I wonder whether this has something to do with class as well. Quite a lot of the women that were part of this exhibition, they came from a range of different types of social backgrounds. It wasn't those, white middle-class women that were in women's images of men. This was a different group of women. And again, without knowing a huge amount about them individually, it's quite hard to say, but I suspect that might be the case. And interestingly, many of the women, the artists in their statements directly reference the women's peace camp at Greenham Common. And again, I think this is, to do with that threat of nuclear war at that particular time. When I first received the catalogue in the post, I was quite surprised at how dated it felt. So I know this is a slightly odd heading for a slide, but I couldn't think of a better way of sort of thinking about it. And I don't really know why that might be. So again, I'm just sort of posing some questions here. Is it because it has this particular mythological theme that the women were asked to respond to? Is it this insistence of it being women only? Although I suspect not, because the same can't be said for women's images of men or about time. Is it because some issues that we would seem to be particularly important now, what seem to be overlooked in the exhibition? There's nothing in it about race. There's nothing really in it about gender, other than maternity and sort of women's work or women's experience. Does it seem a little essentialist in hindsight? Again, there's quite a lot of womb imagery and things. I don't really know. Like I say, I'm just sort of posing questions. And then coming back to this sort of question that I asked at the beginning, where are these women artists now? I'd be really interested to find out what they're doing and how their careers change in response to this show? Did they go on to exhibit in a way that we could seem to be an art career? I don't really, again, I'd be really interested to find out. And then maybe it's just the point that actually, like a lot of things, maybe it was ahead of its time. Maybe it's not yet the time for this exhibition, the works in this exhibition to come to prominence, although maybe I'm doing that now. I don't really know. You know, in the late 70s and early 80s, an era when British feminism was very concerned with the redefinition of femininity. The two shows, Women's Images of Men and About Time, and arguably Lucy Lippard's Issues, which was also held at the ICA. You know, I've lost my track here. I have actually got this written as a sentence, but that's probably the sentence that's there. In addition to the plethora of other women's art exhibitions that preceded Women's Images of Men, of which there were many exhibitions held at the Women's Art Alliance Gallery in London, the 1978 Hayward Annual Exhibition in 1978 that showed works predominantly by women artists, which made a huge impact at the time. So these were all things that had happened preceding Pandora's Box, which you know, arguably this exhibition that I'm talking about here grew out of, and yet it hasn't had the same kind of legacy. And I'm not quite sure why that might be, but I would be very interested to think about it further. And then this is exactly the same image that Brian showed earlier. I just wanted to I thought, as I'd mentioned Women's Images of Men so much, but I thought I should show an image, but you've already seen it. So that's me. Thank you.